Coming up today on LinkedIn News Live. A year plus into the pandemic, many who work from home are experiencing what one expert is calling Zoom fatigue. And it's beyond just the dread of staring at a screen all day. We speak to Dr. Jeremy Bailenson on the psychological consequences of spending hours on video conferences and what can be done about it. Plus, tech startups are hoping FOMO will bring you back to the office. All that next. Hello, I'm Caroline Fairchild, and welcome to LinkedIn News Live, where the business conversation begins with you. Today, we're discussing Zoom fatigue, both the causes as well as the fixes. But first, here's a quick look at the top headlines trending right now on LinkedIn. Lululemon is betting big on like new gear. Rents are increasing again, if you can believe it. And there is a strategy that's new for back to work for tech. Let's take a deeper dive into that story. Tech companies are offering perks for employees to return to the office, hoping that a strong office culture will be the deciding factor for workers to return to their desks. According to the Wall Street Journal, startups are especially prioritizing in-person work. Joining us now to discuss is Jessica Hartog. She's news editor for us here at LinkedIn News. Jessica, good morning. Why is this happening at this point in the pandemic? Why are particularly startups trying to get workers back to their desks?
Hi, Caroline. Well, it's really straightforward. Some companies are just believing that after almost a year of being home, workers are more than happy to return to the office and work in person with their colleagues. They're also betting that a strong office culture will help them recruit the best talent out there.
And what are the benefits? I think back earlier in this pandemic, and there were a lot of companies saying, hey, working from home is working. So what are the benefits of returning back to the office at this point?
Well, it's all about in-person communication, whether it's a sit-down meeting or just grabbing a coffee with a colleague. These companies believe that working in person just means better communication between colleagues, between workers. And, simple things like decisions that could take several Zoom meetings, you have Wi-Fi issues, etc. They're just made much quicker when everyone can just sit down together around a table and talk.
Yeah, I can certainly resonate with that, with the Wi-Fi outages that we've all been experiencing during this pandemic. So how are they exactly convincing employees that now is the right time to go? What if you don't want to go back?
Well, they're offering a lot of benefits, a lot of perks, things such as free lunches, fitness classes. Others are holding happy hours for colleagues to finally be able to catch up in person. Some are even letting you bring to work those pandemic pups that you may have had at home for the past year. It's a little early right now to see how workers are reacting to this news. Obviously, it's not all companies doing this, but the ones who are doing it say that people do really enjoy working in offices. So let's just wait and see where this trend goes.
Well, Jessica, as someone who got a pandemic pup myself, I'm hoping that LinkedIn reconsiders that policy as we return to the office this summer as well. It was great to have you on LinkedIn News Live. Thanks for sharing.
Thank you, Caroline.
That was Jessica Hartog. She's news editor for us here at LinkedIn. And for more stories like these, be sure to check out the news module to the right of your LinkedIn feed. Or if you're in mobile, you can click into that search box. Are you still working from home and feeling the fatigue like me of staring at a screen all day? Well, it turns out that you are not alone. The phenomenon, now commonly known as Zoom fatigue, is prompting companies to question just how much longer workers can be productive while working virtually 24/7. And forget productivity, there are also serious concerns that this mode of working could be harming our mental health. Joining us now to discuss is Stanford professor Jeremy Bailenson, the author of the first peer-reviewed study that deconstructs Zoom fatigue from a psychological perspective. He's also the founding director of Stanford University's Virtual Human Reaction Lab. Jeremy, welcome to LinkedIn News Live.
Thanks for having me, Caroline.
I've been looking forward to this conversation. I'm looking for some solutions here as I'm feeling this, as I'm sure all my colleagues are as well, and the people who are joining us in this stream. I want to start when did you realize at this point in the pandemic that this research needed to happen? What were some of the signs that led you to this body of work?
Yeah, a year ago in March, the last week in March, like many of us, I was in Zoom for 9 hours a day taking meetings, and I did an interview with the BBC at 9:30 a.m. on Friday after a week of just mind-blowing all-day Zooms. And she asked to do the meeting over Zoom. And I've given interviews to the BBC dozens of times over the last 2 decades. And halfway through, I said, why are we on video conference? Well, normally we can just do this on the phone. And at that point, I started writing this article in my head about what are the real causes of Zoom fatigue from a psychological standpoint, focusing on nonverbal behavior.
And you highlight the four main reasons in the study that was peer reviewed. I'm going to bring them up right now. Let's start with the first reason here. Excessive amounts of close-up eye contact is highly intense. What is it exactly about this eye contact that we're now doing virtually that is psychologically harmful?
Eye contact leads to arousal. If you think about how humans evolved, if somebody's very close up to you and staring at you in the eye, one of two things is going to happen. You're about to mate or you're about to have a fight. But in general, we don't have faces that are very close up and staring at us constantly. In a face-to-face meeting, if there's 9 people in the room, 8 people will be looking at the listener. Now, they won't be looking at 8 people will be looking at the speaker. Now, they won't be looking at the speaker for the entire time. They'll look at their notes and they'll look around the room. On Zoom, you get this grid of faces, and even if you're not speaking, you're still getting stared at everybody. So effectively what Zoom does is it transforms listeners into speakers by smothering them with nonverbal cues of faces that are staring right at you in a way that you actually don't get in the real world.
And what is the impact of that in terms of the feeling that you have, say, post the meeting? What are some signs that this is particularly triggering for you?
Well, the idea is that when you are continually aroused, meaning you're physiologically in a state of arousal, which happens when you get stared at constantly, that this just causes you to be fatigued, and it causes mental energy, and it causes you to just feel worn out at the end of the day.
And the other thing about Zoom, Jeremy, is that you're not just looking at other people looking at you, but you're looking at yourself, which I understand is not something that is great for us psychologically.
So this is of all the things that I wish I could get changed tomorrow. And I talked to Zoom and I talked to Microsoft Teams, and we're working on this. Imagine that you're in your physical workplace, and for the entirety of your day, every conversation you had, every box that you lifted, everything that you typed, some person had a handhold mirror and was putting it in your face so that you're forced to look at your own face for 9 hours a day while you were doing work. This would be, nobody would accept this. This would be bonkers. And yet with video conferencing, that's the default for most of these platforms. And many of the platforms don't let you remove it. Zoom at least allows you to right click your image and do what's called hide self view. You can't do that on Microsoft Teams, and you can't do that on WebEx. Now, why is this important? In the 1970s, the first study ever on what's called self-focused attention showed that when there's a mirror in the room or when there's a real-time video of yourself, you scrutinize yourself. You evaluate yourself, you judge yourself, and lots of studies showing, dozens of studies by now, showing that when you see a real-time video of yourself, this causes negative affect and it causes stress because you're constantly looking at yourself and evaluating yourself, and that's just not natural.
Not natural at all. Jeremy, go ahead and take a moment to say hello to some members who are joining us in the stream. We have Robert from Massachusetts, Anna from Toronto, Chris from Quebec, and Adam and Kathy are both joining us from Missouri. Thanks for joining us here on LinkedIn News Live. I'm here with Dr. Jeremy Bailenson. He is a professor at Stanford who's done a ton of research into Zoom fatigue. I know a lot of you joining us in the stream right now may be experiencing that right now, looking at us talk to each other over this virtual environment. So please let us know if you have any questions for Jeremy. We'll get those answered on the show. Jeremy, when it comes to self-view, I've been seeing a slew of headlines recently saying that this is worse for women in particular. Is that accurate?
Yes, so we ran a study led by Geraldine Foville, who is a professor in Sweden, and we got data from over 10,000 people who use Zoom regularly at least once a day. And what we found is that women are more fatigued than men. This is a fairly large effect. It occurs no matter what kind of category or day of the week or use type, whether it's social or work. Women are more fatigued than men. And when you look at the mechanism that's driving that are these nonverbal factors we're talking about. For example, getting stared at by everybody constantly. This affects women more than men. Or looking at your self-view as if it's a mirror. Women are more fatigued than that by men. So what we're seeing is that women who've got a tough time in pandemic already, based on all sorts of life issues around being a woman during pandemic, they also have their meetings are longer than men on average. They don't get to leave as much time between meetings as men do, and they are more fatigued based on these nonverbal factors.
Well, yeah, let's talk about that a little bit. So we're looking at other people, we're seeing other people look at us all the time. We're looking at ourselves. And then on top of that, we're not getting up or moving around, say, an office or something like that. I sometimes find myself on Zoom from the top of this show until 1 or 2 p.m. and this hours have gone by. What's the effect on that?
So you hit it right on the head, which if we were on the phone right now, Caroline, I would have already wandered into 3 different rooms. I'd probably sat on 4 or 5 different chairs. When we talk, we tend to wander and our bodies move. In formal meetings, we have whiteboards, we have water pitchers that we get up and you get to walk around. But because etiquette demands that we stay centered inside this video camera, everyone is sitting in this tiny cone based on the camera's field of view, and we have reduced mobility. Now, this is fatiguing. We know this. However, there's also impacts on productivity. So there's a dissertation at Stanford from the School of Education. When people get to walk around compared to sitting still, walking around causes you to have more creative solutions. It actually enhances cognitive abilities.
And you actually created a scale for people to actually figure out how fatigued they are. I actually took the survey that leads you to a number. I got a 41, so I want to get a grade from you there. And I'm hearing from my producers that we have a link to that exhaustion scale in the stream right now if you want to take it and see how bad you are. So Jeremy, first, talk to us a little bit about the scale. And then I'm at a 41 over here. Or should we be worried about mental health?
So the scale was, again, led by Geraldine Foville, and this took a year, and it began with doing interviews where we had a diverse sample of people that we talked to about their Zoom experiences. Then we got a long list of different items, and through a set of iterative testing over a year with thousands of people, what we ended up with is a sleek 15-item scales, and there's 5 ways you can be fatigued. I can be physically fatigued, my eyes hurt. I can be emotionally fatigued, I feel sad. I can be socially fatigued, I don't want to see other people. I can be motivationally fatigued, I don't feel like doing anything. Or I can be generally fatigued, I just feel like taking a nap. And Caroline, you mentioned your score. The neat thing is, because we're very solutions oriented in my lab, and we don't want to just complain about the medium. In fact, I use Zoom all the time, and I think it's a great piece of software. I'm a huge fan of what they've done. We want to be solution oriented. And the cool thing is, depending on how you're fatigued, there's a different solution. So if you're physically fatigued and your eyes hurt, it's a very different solution than if you're socially fatigued and you don't want to be around other people. And so please do go to zefscale.com or the link that they put up. It's free. We're just using this for academic research, and we're trying to understand who gets fatigued, why, and how to solve it.
And in that study, you actually have a picture of one of the researchers, and you ask a rate of questions about if you thought this person would be good to be in a meeting. And I felt bad because I rated him very poorly. And then at the end, you said that was one of your actual researchers.
Yeah, so we're doing another study, and that one's no longer at the link. So we just changed that yesterday. But I do want to talk about the study because I think it's critical. We talked about how Zoom affects us. There's a whole other aspect, which is little things that you don't think about in your Zoom calls. For example, how high the camera is, which simulates actual height in a room, and how close you are to the camera, whether you're looking at the camera so people look at direct eye contact, or if you're looking down at the screen and they see you looking away. All of these things lead to what we call impression formation. So from 60 years of psychology, we know that people form impressions of others like that. And small details about your face cause people to think differently about you. And when you walk into a physical meeting, you think a lot about where you're going to sit, who you're going to look at. All this planning goes into these very important meetings. And when we're on Zoom, what the problem is, we're not using that same level of rigor about all the details of our camera setup that leads people to form impressions. So this study is really about understanding how quickly people form impressions about the specific details of their Zoom setup, how far they are from the screen, if they've got external lighting, things like that.
Well, we have a ton of new members joining us in the stream, Jeremy, for this conversation. We have Myra from New York, Jesse from Ohio, Kelsey from San Diego, and Linda from North Carolina. And a couple comments I want to call out too. Alexa is saying that she recently purchased a blue light to block screens from her computer, and it was the best decision ever. She said prior to the purchase, I was constantly getting headaches after work. I remember I got blue light glasses at one point during this pandemic, and it was a total game changer. And then Kyle has a question here. He wants to know, does Zoom fatigue tend to have more of an impact on employees in industries that move fast-paced, or is this an issue across all industries?
So great question about the context, and we're starting to scratch the surface. What I was blown away by when I started tunnel visioning on video conferencing, because I study virtual reality, augmented reality, all sorts of virtual communication, I thought there would have been hundreds, if not thousands, of studies over the last 5 decades about video conferencing. Turns out we know very little as a field, and one of the reasons my lab has gone all in on studying this is that we don't know that much about video conference. The one thing we do know about context is we know that people get more fatigued in work than they do in their social context. Now, we are currently looking at the type of work that you do. We just don't have an answer for that yet, but the more people that fill out this questionnaire, the better I'll be answering this the next time you guys have me on.
And Jeremy, going back to what you said about impression formation, I'm thinking about just the millions of workers. We have some on this very team producing this show who started remotely. So they didn't even get a chance to meet their colleagues in person. And now they're returning, they're having to have all these impressions with their colleagues remotely. Are companies doing any sorts of training to let their employees know that things like where the camera is, things like how you position yourself in a video conference could have unconscious biases creep in?
I think companies are smartly beginning to ask the question, how do we think about culture now that we are either all online or going to be hybrid? And I've done a lot of work just talking to different companies and hearing what they're thinking about and what their pain points are, but there's really, the solutions tend to be case by case. I will say we've done a really neat study using immersive virtual reality where you put on the goggles, and we help Sprouts, the supermarket chain, figure out how can they get corporate culture to instantiate for someone that's never actually met the other people. You know, corporate culture is really important. How can you use VR to propagate that by giving people these shared experiences and having them be together and understanding what it's like to be in a place like Sprouts? And I think there's going to be a role for virtual reality as we get more creative with our, how do we think about this new hybrid model?
And we have a question here from Patrick that I think is going to get us to some of the solutions that your work points to. But he asks, have you researched people who don't experience Zoom fatigue? Are there people who are doing this well? What are they bringing into their video calls that's helping them not get tired?
Yeah, again, great question. Thanks for that. So we've now got about 20,000 people that have taken our Zeph scale. And, you know, the distribution is fairly normal. And I would say there is, you know, a good, 1/4 of the population, maybe as much as a third, that doesn't experience Zoom fatigue, and they're doing just fine. Now, what we find is that if you want to reduce it, it's really important to take shorter meetings, and so it's short. The duration of meetings is actually more important than the length of meetings. So try to take really short ones. That's if you can. Extroverts have less Zoom fatigue than introverts. As we've already discussed, men have less fatigue than women. So some of these things are individual differences based, and some are ones you can control. People that are very emotionally stable, there's a personality metric called emotional stability. They tend to do better than those that are less emotionally stable.
And another question here from this stream, Jeremy, Jesse's wondering, is Zoom Teams fatigue the same as just the pandemic blahs, or is this completely different?
Yeah, so great question, and we are about to release a new set of data that looks at that. So you can look at overall well-being and how it relates to Zoom fatigue, and showing that there's a dissociation, meaning the people that feel really good in their life generally can be high in Zoom fatigue. The other thing that I will say in response to that question, which I appreciate, it's a great question, is meetings in general are hard. And they're exhausting. And you know what's great about Zoom is I don't have to drive to work. I don't have to dress up in the same way I did. I mean, there's advantages to taking these virtual meetings. And a lot of our research is not designed to say, boo Zoom, don't use it, but more, let's change the interface. Let's have the tech companies change the interface. And there's a few things we can do. I'll talk about those. And B, from a company standpoint, let's change the culture about what's required in our meetings. So I love Zoom. I think the screen sharing app is function is life-changing for productivity. It's amazing, but there's things we can do to just ease the burden on us.
And what are some of those things as we wait for these companies to make some of the tech changes that you are proposing?
Yeah, there's two huge ones that's going to make your life better instantly. And so the first one I mentioned earlier, which is take your mouse, go to your self-image, right-click it, and do something called hide self-view. What will happen then, others will still see you, but you're not forced to stare at yourself in a mirror the whole time. Now, it's going to take a day or two to get used to. We've all gotten used to this crutch, which is having a real-time mirror and be able to practice your gestures and making sure there's no spinach in your teeth after eating lunch. And it's going to take a day or to get used to, but I promise you that's going to feel better. The second thing is if you go to the top right corner, you're going to see there's these two little boxes. There's an X and then two little boxes and then a dash. If you hit those two little boxes, what it does is it takes the window and it makes it not full screen. And this one is so obvious. I didn't think about this until 2-3 months ago, and I've been thinking about this for a year. If you take the Zoom grid and you squish it down, all of a sudden these faces that are staring at you, they're not so huge anymore. And this is going to sound ridiculous, but once you try it, you're not going to go back. I actually make my Zoom window less than a quarter of the screen. It's still big enough that you can see if somebody's hand goes up, but you don't need to see the pores on their nose in order to have a conversation. So squish that window down.
That's a great point. You don't need to see the pores on their nose to have a productive meeting. We have another question here from the stream. I've seen the comments, they're coming in like wildfire all of a sudden, so we'll share a few of those. But first, what do you recommend should be the duration of meetings so as to avoid this fatigue? Is there a specific time that is the limit?
So I want to be careful of that because I try to be a quantitative scientist and we don't have data on that yet per se. I will say you want to avoid meetings that are 60 minutes and over. We're finding that is one of the biggest causes. The people in that zone tend to have more fatigue. The other thing I will say, and this is a bit more anecdotal, when you're doing work on the screen share, I think the length of the meeting can go up. In other words, when you're working on, say, a shared document and, the focus of everyone's attention is on typing and, talking and working on a thing that's not just focused on staring at the grid, I think you have a bit more freedom to lengthen them out. But I forget Zoom and pandemic for a second. In my life at Stanford, I'm a professor and I'm work with a lot of companies, and I try to set my meetings for no longer than 15 minutes, unless it's a work session. I think a lot of things can get done very quickly, and I think on Zoom we can also differentiate between the work session and the check-in.
Absolutely. Dr. Jeremy Bailenson, why I wanted to bring you on the show is, like everyone else, I saw all the headlines about your study, just the doom and gloom around Zoom fatigue. But if you actually look at your work, you're optimistic that we can find solutions and that we can be more productive while working from home. And you actually equate the productivity that we can probably see with rethinking this remote work virtually to how we adapted with elevators. Can you talk a little bit about that and how we interact in elevators today?
Yeah, so for any professor that teaches about nonverbal behavior, we talk about trade-offs, okay? And the elevator is an amazing metaphor because when you get in an elevator, people step into your personal space and you do something you would never do outside an elevator, which is stand about 4 inches away from someone that you don't know. And so how do we solve that? We use one nonverbal behavior to compensate for this, to reduce that intimacy. So what do? We look down. We look at our feet or we look at the ceiling. The problem is right now, the way that Zoom is designed, you've got this grid of faces always staring at you no matter what. It's like being in an elevator and every single person in that elevator slowly rotates their bodies and then stares you right in the eye for the entire ride. But then it's even worse. It's as if that elevator ride lasts for an hour. And so it's when you take a step back and think about that as how the interface is designed, it's wildly outlandish that's what we decided. And this isn't a Zoom decision. This is how video conferences have been run for quite some time. I believe this is so solvable by rethinking the interface and just taking a big step back.
Well, Jeremy, I know I speak for the stream when I say thanks so much for joining us on this show. I'm seeing so many people having comments thanking you for your work. Eliza says, what a timely and wonderful topic to cover off on. Thanks for offering this. And thank you, Dr. Bailenson, for joining us on the show.
Thanks for having me. Great questions all around. And this was super fun.
That was Dr. Bailenson talking to us from Stanford about Zoom fatigue, both the solutions as well as the fixes. And I appreciate him for joining us on the show. All right, tomorrow on LinkedIn News Live, we're going to be revealing our top companies list, where the top places are to work right now. It's our annual guide to the best places to grow and develop your schools. And guess what? They're all hiring. I'm Caroline Fairchild. Thanks for watching LinkedIn News Live.